My name is Kay Byfield, and this is your ArtSpeaks studio moment from ArtSpeaks Studio in Dallas, Texas. Today we're going to talk about space. The elements of design are line, size, shape, value, color, texture, and space. Today we're going to talk about space, but space is a confusing term because some people talk about space in two contexts. One, they talk about space in terms of depth and the ability of an artist to convey depth on a two-dimensional surface. And other people also talk about space in terms of positive and negative space. I think that's confusing. And so therefore, I only use positive and negative shapes because that seems much more reasonable and understandable and clear. And I confine the discussion of space to depth. So that's what we're going to do today. We begin to see a sense of depth around the time of the Renaissance. Prior to that, artworks were flattened. There was still a sense of depth and space, but it wasn't pictorially accurate the way that the eyes would see things as far as near and far, and the way that a photograph would reflect depth. So this begins during the Renaissance. You see in this painting by Leonardo da Vinci, there is close-up with the figure and then extreme depth in the distance and not a lot of mid-distance. But this was because the close-up was intended to be the focus of the painting, but he wanted to give her some context. Except for the romantic landscape painters of the 18th century, most artists since the Renaissance have confined the sense of depth so that it's a shallower space. And this is because they are focusing on their subject and they don't want to create a larger context or have an intrusion from a much deeper space. By closing the back of the painting with a shallower space, they maintain the focus on the subject, which is what the artist was really interested in. With their exposure to Japanese woodblock prints in the 19th century, the Post-Impressionists, including Vincent van Gogh, Cézanne, Gauguin, and many others, flattened the pictorial space in their own work. They brought the background forward and reduced modeling in the depicted objects. This begins to flatten the treatment of space. Cézanne's work as a post-impressionist led to the subsequent artworks of Picasso, Georges Braque, and Henri Matisse, all of whom even more flattened the space. Of course, this was new and revolutionary in Western art since the Renaissance, but it had always been apparent in other cultures like the Egyptians, the Chinese, the Indians, as well as the Japanese. And this was because they were not particularly interested in pictorial accuracy. They were trying to tell a different kind of truth about their subject. Artists today have a full range of options in the way that they handle space. They can flatten it entirely and create just shapes, or they can exaggerate space and give an extreme sense of depth. The choice depends on what they're trying to accomplish with their work. If you flatten space entirely, you end up with just shapes. And so the artwork is about shapes and colors and patterns. On the other hand, you can minimize space, you can have space that's limited, or you can exaggerate depth. And that depends on what your subject matter is and what you're trying to say about that subject. So if you give a panorama, a landscape with far distances, you're trying to say something probably about how vast the earth is, or about how small objects are in the context of the larger world. The choice of flattening space or not is entirely up to the artist. So there are 4 ways to create a sense of space. There's aerial or atmospheric perspective. There is linear perspective. There are relative size differences, and there is overlapping. And using those 4 strategies will result in a sense of space. So let me give you some examples. So here is a little illustration of what we call aerial or atmospheric perspective. And the way that this works is that objects that are closer, that are nearer to you in the foreground, those objects will be more defined, sharper, brighter, with more detail than objects that are further away successively. With linear perspective, we are conveying how the road or a railroad track or a river goes off into a distance, and it goes to a vanishing point. So it gets narrower and narrower and narrower until it goes into the distance. And this is a strategy that is used all the time. We use it with buildings, we use it with landscapes, anything where there is a near and a very far distance, we use some kind of linear perspective. It can be 1 point, 2 point, and so forth. With relative size, I used linear perspective to make it clear what was happening here, but you would be able to say that this automobile is further away from you than this automobile because this is bigger. So even without using the linear perspective, and this tree is closer, these trees are closer, while these trees are further away because they're smaller. It also helps if the object that is further away is higher up on the picture plane and so forth. But the basic strategy is larger means it's closer, smaller means it's further away. The other means of showing distance and relative closeness to us is by overlapping. And so here you see that the goose that's in the front is bigger, the goose that's behind it is a little bit smaller, and the one behind it is a little bit smaller, but they overlap each other, which gives you even more of a sense of depth. Space is an important element of design and is fundamental to the work that artists do. By using the elements of design like space, artists are able to say what they're trying to get across in their paintings. I hope you've enjoyed this overview of space in this week's ArtSpeaks Studio Moment, and we will see you again very soon. Bye.